The truck hissed, shuddered, and died. Its rust-bitten tailgate slammed open, metal on metal, with a clang that snapped the morning silence like a rifle bolt. Cold Nebraska wind shot through the open bed, drawing sharp breaths from the 25 German POWs huddled in the back. They didn't move at first. No one wanted to be the first one off. Then, slowly, stiffly, they began to step down. One by one, boots hit the muddy earth with soft, reluctant thuds. Sergeant Carl Drexler was the 10th man down. The moment his foot sank into the slush, a chill shot through his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. His hand, still mottled from frostbite endured on the Eastern Front, twitched at his side, instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Not anymore. He had nothing left now but the uniform on his back and the ache in his bones. To his right, Private Bruno Metz coughed into a gloved fist. "You smell that?" he muttered, scanning the rows of fences and towers. "Smells like disinfectant and lies." Carl didn't respond. He wasn't looking at the towers or the guards. His eyes were locked on something that didn't belong in a war camp. Not the way it stood, not the way it moved. It was a dog. A large, golden creature trotting along the inside perimeter, weaving between American soldiers like it owned the place. Carl froze. His breath caught. The dog had no leash, no muzzle, no handler shouting orders, just golden fur catching the wind, a pink tongue lolling slightly out of its mouth. It was calm. Too calm. Trained dogs, Carl knew, were never this relaxed. He'd seen what German shepherds did to prisoners caught near fences. He'd heard the screams. Beside him, Bruno tensed and whispered, "They let it roam." Must be trained to kill Carl, said nothing, but his thoughts raced. Was this some kind of psychological tactic? Let the enemy see a calm dog, lure them into a false sense of safety, then unleash it when they ran? A low whistle blew from the far side of the gate. A young American corporal gestured them forward toward a low wooden structure labeled Barracks C. The prisoners shuffled in uneven formation, flanked by rifle-bearing guards in thick coats. The snow had melted days ago, but the ground was still soft, giving beneath every step like a trap ready to spring. As they passed the gate, Carl glanced back. The dog was closer now, trotting, tongue hanging, eyes curious. Its gaze met Carl's, and then nothing. No bark, no lunge, no flash of aggression. The dog simply looked up at him with mild interest, then continued past without breaking stride. Carl's legs almost buckled. He'd braced for teeth, for fury, for pain. But all he got was indifference, or worse, recognition. He turned his head sharply and focused on the barracks door ahead. Don't show weakness, he told himself. Don't ask questions. Just survive. But his mind wouldn't let go. Why would a camp allow a loose dog among prisoners? The idea scratched at the edge of logic like a pebble in a boot. Inside the barracks, the air was warmer, barely. A coal stove crackled in the corner. Rows of bunk beds stretched like tired soldiers against both walls. The wooden floor creaked under Carl's weight as he made his way to an empty bunk, tossing his satchel onto the straw-stuffed mattress. Bruno collapsed onto the lower bunk beside him and whispered, "We should keep watch." That dog comes near, we grab the bed frame legs. Carl sat stiffly, trying not to show how his hands trembled. "I don't think it needs to be near to hurt us," he said, glancing toward the small dust-smeared window. Out in the courtyard, the dog sat in the sun, tongue lolling, tail brushing idly across the gravel. Across the room, a few prisoners were already whispering among themselves. "Did you see it? It didn't blink. What if they trained it to look friendly, just to fool us?" That night, as the barracks dimmed into silence and snoring, Carl lay awake, one arm curled around the metal bedpost, the other tucked beneath his head. He stared at the shadows moving across the rafters, mind racing. The war had taught him many things: codes, survival, distrust, but never had he encountered an enemy so unreadable. That dog had passed by like it belonged here, as if the fences weren't for keeping prisoners in, but for letting something else roam freely. He rolled onto his back, feeling the scratch of the straw through the thin mattress. He didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He just looked up at me and kept walking. Lieutenant Harold Stein's pen snapped in half. He hadn't meant to press down so hard, but the fountain pen gave under his hand just as he finished the line. All measures conform to Geneva standards, including canine control protocols. Ink bled across the margin of the yellowed page like a spill that couldn't be undone. He sighed and reached for another sheet from the stack, wiping his fingers with the inside hem of his uniform. The office smelled faintly of oilskin and burnt coffee, the pot in the corner long empty but still steaming. Outside the window, past the smudged glass and weather-worn blinds, the compound shifted through late-morning shadows, watchtowers still, guards changing posts, and, in the far distance, the golden blur of fur trotting beside the eastern fence line. "Damn dog," Stein muttered, glancing at the typewriter ribbon that had already begun to jam. There was no official mention of Baxter in any camp manual. No handler was assigned. No vet logs. No command documentation. Technically, the dog wasn't even enlisted or owned by the military. He had been smuggled into Camp Alderwind under quiet circumstances by one of the guards, Private Lewis, a soft-voiced teenager from Clay County whose family farm had been flattened in a spring tornado. The dog had survived. The family hadn't. Now the mutt circled the perimeter as if he'd always belonged, head high, tail swinging like a pendulum between fear and familiarity. Stein rubbed his temple and looked again at the draft before him. He didn't like writing lies, but he liked being transferred even less. The memo from Fort Brinton had been clear. All camps must report updated discipline measures, including animal deterrent programs, in light of recent escape attempts across the Midwestern Circuit. Stein knew Camp Alderwind was barely on anyone's radar. No escape attempts. No uprisings. Not even graffiti. But that wasn't due to razor wire or extra rations. It was because of fear. The wrong kind. Baxter didn't snarl. He didn't bark at prisoners unless they startled him, but the Germans didn't know that, and no one told them. That was the quiet arrangement. Across the compound in Barracks C, Sergeant Carl Drexler sat hunched over his bunk, blanket drawn tight around his shoulders. He'd taken to writing in the evenings when the lights dimmed and the guards' boots softened into routine patrols. In his lap, he balanced a smuggled Red Cross diary with pages so thin he feared his pen might tear them. He wrote slowly, each letter deliberate. Dog paces perimeter. No commands, no muzzle. Perhaps it's drugged. He paused, listening. The shuffle of boots. A cough 2 bunks down. Then the sound that made his shoulders tighten, soft paw steps passing outside the barracks wall. It was Baxter again. Bruno Metz stirred from the upper bunk, his breath hitching like a man waking from a half-dreamed ambush. "He's back," Bruno whispered, sliding his feet into his boots. He never slept without them anymore. "Pacing again." Carl didn't reply. He didn't need to. The pattern was always the same. Around midnight the dog would circle, once, twice, then pause near their window, tail still, ears alert. Bruno leaned forward and whispered again. "Last night I swear it growled. Low. Like it knew me, Carl considered this. Then crossed out the word drugged and replaced it with, or trained without sound." Back in the administrative office, Lieutenant Stein watched the dog with an unease he couldn't name. From the far window he could see Lewis now, crouching beside the dog offering a strip of jerky. Baxter took it gently, never growling, never leaping. Stein lit a cigarette, though he hadn't touched one in weeks. He knew what the camp director expected in that report. Assurance. Clean statistics. Compliance. But what he'd typed, what now sat ink-dried across carbon paper, was only partly true. The camp was calm. The prisoners were quiet. And Baxter, however unofficial, had become the camp's best-kept secret. a deterrent with no teeth. And yet, the fear it stirred worked better than any fence. Later that afternoon, Private Lewis stood near the edge of the mess hall with Baxter resting against his leg. The dog's golden coat shimmered in the sunlight. Guards passed by without comment. One nodded. Another scratched behind Baxter's ears. No one asked for paperwork. No one asked for purpose. "Lewis," a voice called behind him. It was Corporal Nash, clipboard in hand. Lewis stood upright. "Sir, you've got dog duty again tonight. Just keep him near Barracks C. Word is they're jittery in there." "Yes, sir." "But Baxter he doesn't patrol, sir." "He doesn't have to," Nash said, tapping the clipboard. "They think he does. That's what matters." Lewis hesitated. "He's just a farm dog." "Then let them believe the farm taught him blood." That night, Carl's diary continued. "We saw the boy again. He whistled. The dog came, sat beside him. No leash, no order. It followed by choice. Is that loyalty? Or training we cannot see?" In the bunk above, Bruno refused to sleep. He sat against the wooden wall, eyes fixed on the dark gap beneath the door. "He's out there," Bruno said, "waiting." Carl didn't answer. He folded the diary closed and hid it beneath his cot. Outside, Lewis laid his jacket on the ground. Baxter curled on it without sound. Inside the administrative office, Lieutenant Stein slid the final report into its envelope. He sealed it, pressed his initials across the fold, and added it to the outbound mail stack marked for Fort Brinton. Then he paused. He reached for his pen again and underlined one sentence in his personal notes. "All measures conform to Geneva standards, including canine control protocols." He stared at the words. They didn't feel like his own, but they were necessary, for now. Across the yard, the moonlight cast long shadows over the fence and across the silent dog lying still beside the barracks wall. And behind closed eyes, every man inside feared a moment that would never come. We feared what we never understood, and that fear made liars out of everyone. The sound of boots on packed dirt was all that could be heard. A hard wind whistled through the parade ground at Camp Alderwind as 25 German POWs stood in perfect formation, their breath fogging in the crisp morning air. The inspection had begun. Somewhere behind the row of American guards stood the Swiss delegate, clipboard tucked under one arm, his gray overcoat snapping with each gust. Carl Drexler stood third from the left in the front row, his back straight, shoulders squared, but heart pounding like a drum. A young corporal had barked at him just minutes before. "If your collar's off center, you'll answer for it, Kraut." Beside Carl stood Bruno Metz, lips barely moving as he whispered, "Is he here yet?" Carl didn't respond. He didn't have to. The shift in atmosphere had already told them. The guards weren't barking orders anymore. They were frozen, watching, waiting. Then it happened. Baxter trotted into view, paws soft against the dirt, tongue slightly out, ears perked, not in aggression, but curiosity. He wasn't leashed. No one had sent him. The golden retriever moved with a casual confidence, oblivious to the rigid tension around him. Every man, German and American alike, locked eyes on him. Not a single soul breathed. Bruno's voice trembled. "He's testing us." Carl's stomach sank. He didn't look at Bruno. He didn't dare break formation. But he could feel the sweat forming beneath his collar, cold against his spine. This was the moment. He had known it would come. The dog had always lingered in the background, pacing the perimeter like a silent warden. But this was something else. Baxter moved slowly, deliberately, weaving through the spaces between the POWs and the guards, tail wagging in slow, steady arcs. The silence was crushing. One misstep, one twitch, and the entire scene could collapse. The Swiss inspector paused mid-note, eyes flicking to the dog as if unsure whether this was part of the display. The Americans didn't move. No one did. Baxter sniffed at the boots of a POW in the back row. The man flinched, barely perceptible, but enough that the guard nearest to him tightened his grip on the rifle. Then the dog moved on. Another pair of boots, another sniff. And then, inexplicably, Baxter turned and trotted directly toward Carl. Drexler's jaw locked. His muscles ached with restraint. He couldn't risk reacting. He stared forward, pretending he didn't see the golden blur closing in from the edge of his vision. Baxter stopped, right at Carl's feet. The retriever looked up, brown eyes soft, unblinking, and sat. No bark, no growl, just a quiet thump as his hindquarters hit the ground, tail brushing against Carl's boot. For 3 full seconds, time collapsed. Then a sound broke the silence, the measured voice of the Red Cross envoy. "Sehr gehorsamer Hund," the inspector murmured in accented German. "Very obedient animal." Carl didn't understand at first. The words blurred, lost in the rush of panic. His limbs locked, sweat now rolling down his temple. He dared a glance downward. Baxter stared up at him with the calm indifference of a house pet waiting for someone to throw a stick. The envoy, apparently satisfied, scribbled something on his clipboard and continued walking down the line. Behind him, one of the American officers exchanged a look with the camp interpreter. A shrug. Then the moment passed. But it hadn't passed for Carl. He didn't move, not until the dog gave a great yawn, stood up, stretched, and ambled away toward the edge of the ground. Only then did Carl allow his lungs to inflate. That evening, back inside Barracks C, the atmosphere remained unsettled. No one spoke above a whisper. Some joked nervously, others said nothing. But Carl couldn't shake the image of Baxter's eyes, how they hadn't judged, hadn't threatened. They'd simply been there. He sat on his cot long after lights out. The smuggled Red Cross diary balanced on one knee. Candlelight flickered from a corner where Bruno tried to fix a broken belt buckle with a spoon. Outside, the guards' boots thudded faintly as they changed shifts. Carl began to write, slowly and with care. The enemy's dog chose me. Not to bite, not to growl, to sit beside. No orders, no threat, just a choice. And below that, in slightly smaller letters, he added, "What we feared as a weapon turned out to be a witness." The order came down on a Wednesday morning, crisp and matter-of-fact. "Reassign the Golden Dog to post-rotation," read the typed slip handed to Private Lewis, barely 19 and still green enough to hesitate before questioning anything with an officer's signature. He read it twice, then looked up at the corporal delivering it. "Baxter's not trained for anything, sir," he said cautiously. The corporal gave a dismissive shrug, already moving on. "Orders are orders." Lewis folded the slip into quarters and shoved it into his jacket pocket, biting down on the instinct to argue. Behind him, Baxter lay sprawled near the barracks steps, head on his paws, tail thudding lazily against the wooden floor. The golden retriever looked up with a soft huff, eyes half-lidded in the morning sun. To Lewis, he looked more like a house pet than a post sentinel. And that was the problem. At Fort Brinton, 100 miles east, the atmosphere was anything but lazy. Inside a cluttered operations room, Colonel Matthew Rusk stood beneath a wall-mounted map speckled with red pins, each one marking a POW camp in the Midwest. He held the latest interbase memorandum in one hand and a pencil in the other, circling phrases as he read aloud. Multiple escape attempts. Heightened risk. Increased perimeter vigilance recommended. He tapped the page once, then scribbled a note in the margin. Effective deterrence. Colonel Rusk had never visited Camp Alderwind. To him, it was just another rural entry on the logistics chart. Fewer escapees than the northern compounds, fewer discipline reports, fewer updates altogether. That lack of trouble wasn't reassuring. It was suspicious. It implied a lack of oversight. And so, in his eyes, it made sense to send down the same canine control directives used in higher-risk facilities. No exemptions, no context, no nuance. By Friday, the rumors inside Alderwind had started to spread. "They're training the dog again," Bruno whispered from the corner bunk, lacing his boots even though it was lights out. "I saw them lead him behind the canteen." Carl Drexler looked up from his cot, brows furrowed. "Louis?" he asked. "Was he with him?" Bruno nodded, pulling the laces tight. "Didn't look happy?" That much was true. Louis had spent the afternoon walking Baxter in tight circles between the latrine shed and the tool garage, trying to look like he was following protocol. Occasionally, he'd stop and gesture vaguely, hoping no one could tell he wasn't giving real commands. Baxter simply followed, tail wagging, pausing every now and then to sniff a rusted shovel or chase a grasshopper. "What are we even doing, boy?" Louis muttered under his breath, kneeling to scratch the dog's ears. Baxter leaned into it, eyes closing with a soft groan of contentment. "They think you're a threat now. A danger. They're making a show out of you." That show took shape on Monday, when a camera crew from the training division arrived unannounced, hauling a bulky tripod and a half-dozen reels of black and white film. They were documenting deterrence procedures for instructional reels to be distributed across camps in the region. "Where's the dog?" asked one of the cameramen, scanning the camp with an impatient frown. Louis stood stiffly by the barracks gate. "He's not trained. He's not even enlisted. Don't need him to do anything," the man said, waving him off. "We just need a shot. Dog by the fence, guard standing tall." That sort of thing. Baxter was led into the frame, confused but obedient, and made to sit beside a mock-up section of fence hastily built from leftover lumber. A young guard was told to stand at attention beside him, holding a rifle and looking stern. The camera whirred. From behind the barracks window, Bruno and Carl watched in uneasy silence. "They're making him into something he's not," Carl murmured. "It's for show." Bruno didn't answer. He was staring at Baxter, whose tail thumped once on the dirt, then stopped. The dog tilted his head slightly toward the camera crew, as if trying to understand what was happening. There was no menace in his posture, no readiness to leap, just confusion and maybe a little sadness. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the men in Barracks C lined up for roll call, the buzz had shifted. No one talked about escape routes or food rations. They talked about the dog. "I heard he's been retrained," one man muttered. "They're using him like the camps in the South." "Like those attack shepherds. I saw a guard shove him toward the fence," another added. "Made him bark." Just once it wasn't true, but the image was already taking hold in their minds. That night, Bruno laid down in full uniform, boots still on, eyes wide open beneath the rafter shadows. "He'll come for us," he said aloud, voice barely above a whisper. "Next time, it won't be a sit." "It'll be a signal." Carl didn't answer. He turned on his side, pulling his thin blanket tighter, staring at the fading moonlight that spilled through the narrow window. Part of him wanted to believe it was all nonsense, but part of him remembered the way Baxter had walked the parade line weeks ago, calm, slow, uncommanded, and sat beside him. That moment had felt meaningful. This new performance felt hollow, artificial. Down by the fence, Louis sat beside Baxter, watching the stars. The photo crew had long since gone, packing their reels into dusty cases and promising quick edits. No one had asked if the dog understood what any of it meant. Louis reached into his pocket and pulled out a biscuit. Baxter perked up instantly, eyes alert, tail gently sweeping the grass. "No training needed for that, huh?" Louis whispered, offering it forward. The dog took it gingerly and sat, as he always did, eyes fixed on the boy who never gave him orders, only kindness. In a few weeks, the training reel would be shown at Fort Brinton. It would display a steady, obedient guard dog beside a steely-eyed soldier, all backlit in sepia tones, the illusion complete. To the higher-ups, it would look like compliance, control, power. But in reality, Baxter had never passed his military screening. The test officer had written a single word in red ink across his evaluation file: too gentle. He'd failed the bite test. He'd refused to growl. He didn't posture, didn't dominate, didn't chase. He just sat. And now, captured on grainy film, he would become the face of something he never was. The picture made it look like a weapon. But it was just a dog sitting for a biscuit. The first crack of thunder was not what woke Carl Drexler. It was the sudden, high-pitched bark that split the night like a rifle shot. He sat upright in his bunk, heart already hammering, before his eyes fully opened. The barracks trembled slightly under the pressure of a howling wind, rain slashing against the tin roof like nails. A second bark rang out, closer this time, sharper. Carl blinked toward the narrow window slits. "Bruno," he hissed. A grunt answered from the bunk above. "What time is it?" Before Carl could answer, the emergency siren blared across the compound, its rising wail cutting through the storm's chaos like a scream. Boots thudded on the ground outside. Shouts. Flashlights flickered against the fogged glass. Carl threw off his blanket. The air inside Barracks C was clammy and thick, the scent of coal smoke mingled with sweat and fear. Lightning flashed, illuminating the hunched silhouettes of fellow prisoners now stirring. A few were already reaching for their boots. Others froze, eyes darting. Then came the sound no one expected: wood splintering. Not gunfire, not a shout, just the long, cracking groan of something old giving out. "The fence," Bruno said, suddenly awake and cold with realization. Carl moved to the window. In the white pulse of lightning, he saw it. The eastern perimeter, just past the latrine building, where a massive oak limb had broken free and collapsed onto the wire mesh. The fence had buckled inward, torn and sagging, exposed, vulnerable. Another bark, urgent, wild. "Baxter," Carl whispered. He didn't know how he recognized the sound, but he did. It wasn't the tail-wagging bark he'd heard in daylight. This one was raw, protective. Booted footsteps pounded toward the breach, but Baxter was faster. In the next lightning flash, Carl saw the golden blur dart across the wet grass, mud kicking up in arcs beneath his paws. The guards hadn't even reached their posts. The dog was already there. Bruno appeared beside Carl, eyes wide. "He's running straight for us." "No," Carl said, his voice thin. "No, he's not." Outside, chaos unfolded. Guards shouting conflicting orders. One slipped on the wet gravel. Another fumbled with a flashlight. But Baxter didn't hesitate. He charged forward and skidded to a stop just inside the broken fence line. Then he turned, not toward the camp, but away from it. His entire posture shifted, ears back, body rigid, hackles up. And then he barked. Not a warning to the prisoners. Not a command. A challenge to something beyond. Two shapes emerged from the darkness beyond the trees. Shuffling, hunched figures, soaked from head to toe, paused under the downpour. Even from the window, Carl could see one was holding something. Long, maybe a walking stick. Number. A rake handle. Bruno squinted. Civilians. The guards approached from both sides, rifles raised. One of them, a tall one Carl recognized as Clements, yelled, "Stay where you are." The silhouettes froze. The taller one raised his hands. "We're not thieves," he shouted. "We came to trade." The shorter one added, "Tobacco, for coffee." That's all. But the guards were already advancing. Behind them, Baxter remained at the broken fence, not moving, not barking anymore, just watching. The rain soaked his fur, but he stayed like a sentinel carved in gold. Carl couldn't stop staring. For weeks he had braced for the moment the dog would snap, tear into someone during roll call, chase down a man with too much hope in his eyes. But now, with the camp exposed, the guards floundering and chaos all around, Baxter had placed himself between the compound and the unknown. Not to attack. To guard. By the time the civilians were escorted away, shivering, handcuffed, muttering about desperate barters and starving families, The storm had begun to ease. The sky, once roiling with thunderheads, began to break open, revealing faint starlight. Guards moved in with tools and scrap lumber to shore up the fence. Orders barked, names checked. Back in Barrack C, no one slept. Bruno sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the floor. "He could have run," he said quietly. There was nothing stopping him. Carl was drying his socks by the coal stove, his fingers trembling. "He could have attacked, too," he added, "and no one would have questioned it." Neither man spoke for a while. Then Carl looked up, his voice barely more than breath. But he didn't. He stood between us and the woods, like he was watching for something we couldn't see. Bruno gave a dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. "We feared him every day," he said, "but tonight I was glad he was out there." Carl nodded slowly. Outside, as the wind finally died, a single bark echoed into the early morning hush. Low, assured, then silence. "He wasn't protecting them from us," Bruno murmured, eyes wide. "He was protecting us from something we hadn't seen coming." The photograph fell from the stack like any other, slightly curled at the corners, its black and white tones faded but intact. It slid across the polished table in the Geneva Archives room and came to a stop beneath the reading lamp's pale glow. One of the Red Cross reviewers, a young intern named Malric, reached for it absent-mindedly, already scribbling notes on the margins of another document. But the moment his eyes landed on the image, his pen froze mid-stroke. A dog. Not snarling, not lunging, not restrained, just sitting, calm and almost regal, beside a line of uniformed German POWs standing at attention. "Is this an error?" he whispered, tilting the photo toward the light. "Why would a camp allow this?" The question wasn't rhetorical. He circled it with a red pencil in the margin of the catalog sheet and passed it to his supervisor, who raised an eyebrow before setting the image aside, uninterested. But Malric couldn't let it go. Something about the composition of the scene gnawed at him. Not just the presence of the dog, but the prisoners' faces. Some were blank. Others were tight with tension. And one, near the center, looked oddly relieved, as if the dog's presence meant something only he understood. That same afternoon, while cataloging adjacent documents from the same box, Malric opened a weathered file marked Camp Alderwind, Disciplinary Protocols. Inside was a faded letter, typed neatly in German, with an English translation clipped beneath. The name on the letterhead struck him immediately. Sergeant Karl Drexler. He read the first lines with increasing intensity. "To the International Committee of the Red Cross, I write not to accuse, but to clarify. We feared what we did not understand, and in fearing him, we allowed policy to grow from silence." The letter described the dog in the photograph, identified simply as Baxter, as a figure of tension, myth, and quiet power among the prisoners. Drexler wrote of long nights spent watching the animal roam the perimeter, of rumors swirling that it was trained to attack, and of the eerie sense that the dog understood far more than any man gave it credit for. Malric leaned back in his chair, staring at the photo again. But the letter went further. It outlined how the guards never corrected the prisoner's assumptions, how the dog, though never aggressive, became a tool of discipline by omission. Drexler described the moment Baxter sat beside him during the Red Cross inspection, a moment burned into his memory, when fear collided with confusion and nothing happened. The absence of violence, Drexler wrote, was louder than its presence. He had written the letter years after his release, now a translator in Hamburg, haunted not by cruelty, but by misunderstood mercy. "We were made to fear him, and in fearing him, we never understood him. But he understood us." Malric set the letter down with care. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that something deeply human had been buried beneath procedural reports and silence. Across the ocean, in a modest home outside Lawrence, Kansas, Private Lewis, now in his 60s, adjusted the frame above his fireplace. The photo had faded over the years, but the figure of Baxter remained clear. Visitors often mistook it for a family pet or some award photo from his military days. He never corrected them unless they asked. That evening, an old friend from the post office stopped by for coffee. Noticing the photo, he squinted and chuckled. "That one ever bite you?" Lewis shook his head, smiling softly. "No, but he sure scared some truth out of people outside." Wind rustled the dry leaves against the porch. Inside, the fire crackled, and the dog in the photo seemed somehow to be watching still. In a war of weapons and wires, it was a dog who broke through without saying a word. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of compassion, humanity, and the unexpected kindness that can bridge even the deepest divides of war. Its purpose is to inspire empathy, reflection, and hope for reconciliation in times of conflict.